When in doubt, process it. Of course, this is in relation to evidence or possible evidence. John Carter and Brad Von Bargen are the last two documented people to see Caitlyn alive. John's car was processed. Even Karen Winkler's car, John's mother, had her car processed as well by the Fairfield Police Department. But for some reason, Brad Von Bargen's car was not processed. Why? He was the second to last person that we know of to see Katelyn Markham alive. He was at her house that night, the last night she was seen. The Fairfield Police Department made a decision not to process Brad Von Bargen's car. Now, I'm not saying Brad is guilty of anything. What I am saying is if you have individuals at a victim's house just shortly before the victim goes missing, you might want to obtain items that were present at the location for processing. Maybe clothing, shoes, maybe, a car. It was important to process John Carter's car and his mother's car, but not Brad's car? What would it hurt? He was there at Caitlyn's house, and at minimum, you could rule his car out as being the vehicle that transported her to Indiana. And with that, you could possibly rule Brad out himself with his alibi and other processes of investigation. Unfortunately, the failure to process Brad's car leaves a question that may remain unanswered and makes it that much more difficult to find out what happened to Katelyn Markham. This is Gone at 21, Katelyn Markham's death investigation. After returning from my second trip from Ohio, I continued with the investigation, and the first person I spoke with was Brad Von Bargen. During our conversation, he mentioned his car in 2011, a green Acura. He referred to it as his baby. So as we were speaking, I looked the car up through his historical DMV records. I found the car and the new owner's name before Brad and I got off the phone. Brad also mentioned the police never processed it. Brad and I also spoke about me going to North Carolina and meeting face to face. Brad suggested we meet for coffee, but didn't want anyone else there. No secretary to take notes or anybody. He also said I would not be able to record him. A couple of days later, he called me and said he's not willing to meet with me, and he apologized for the confusion. This was the third time he seemed to be okay with meeting me, then changing his mind. I spoke to the benefactor, and he was on board with obtaining the car if FPD, Fairfield Police Department, didn't act and process it. I sent the information to the Indiana State Police, Detective Vance Patton, and he spoke to Detective Irvin of the Fairfield Police Department about processing the car. A week after Patton spoke to Irvin, I texted Detective Irvin and asked her if the Fairfield Police Department was going to approve processing Brad's car. Her response? It's being discussed. You can see that text from Detective Irvin on the Gone at 21 Facebook page. After reporting this response to the benefactor, he said, Let's get it. He didn't trust that the Fairfield Police Department would go out and process this vehicle. And we thought it was important because it hadn't been done. I contacted the newer owner of the Acura. After a little digging, of course, he had moved and he got a new phone number within recent months. The owner mentioned that he used to work with Brad and he bought the car from him just before Brad left to go to North Carolina. He said Brad was in a hurry to sell the car. And he also dropped the price of the car out of nowhere. The owner didn't ask him to drop the price. He just dropped it to sell it quickly. After purchasing the car from Brad, the owner said it sat in his mom's garage for over a year, close to a year and a half. It needed work before he could drive it. After explaining to him who I was and that I wanted to buy his car, he was hesitant and didn't really understand why someone would pay twice what it was worth. Well, it was for his inconvenience and the car wasn't that expensive. We went back and forth for a while and I finally convinced him I was for real. The benefactor had a check ready the next day. I picked it up and sent it next day mail to the current owner of the vehicle. A couple of days later, I received the title. After getting the paperwork squared away, I called Detective Patton and asked what towing company I should use to transport the car to Indiana as a crime scene. I then contacted that towing company and arranged the pickup. Well, the testing was done in Indiana and it turned up a positive hit. The location that hit came from was in the trunk area. The swabs were sent to the Fairfield Police Department and they sent samples to the Ohio State Lab for further testing in an attempt to obtain DNA. I tried to get Indiana to do the rest of the testing, but that didn't happen. I didn't trust the Fairfield Police Department, so apparently I'm taking Indiana and Fairfield's word that it was sent out. Unfortunately, the lab couldn't extract DNA from the samples. Now, I wouldn't find this out until early 2016, late 2015, but I decided to put it in here at this time because it kind of fits. Tina Barrett, the Markham family attorney, explains about a conversation she had with a sergeant from the Fairfield Police Department about this particular car. She also goes into the conscious decision that Fairfield made about processing Brad's car. We also spoke about the lab results. What did the sergeant say about this piece of evidence, which has been identified now, public knowledge, Brad Von Bargen's car? What did he say about that piece of evidence not being processed?
Well, he said that that at this juncture, they agreed that why not? There was no evidence, so it had been secured by a third party, and they agreed it was worth a look-see, but he wanted me to know that it wasn't a myth, that they hadn't overlooked it years ago, that they had made the conscious decision back then not to pursue it.
That's much different than saying we just missed it.
That was their position. I don't think there's a secret to that. That they knew this person existed. They knew what his connection to Caitlyn was. They knew what his interaction with Caitlyn was purported to be the last night that she was known to be alive. And obviously they knew he had a car, and they didn't process it. And
no, they processed John Carter's car, right? The Katelyn Markham's fiance.
That's my understanding. I don't know that I have, I don't know that I have any any knowledge that I can share. I think they did process some cars. I don't know to what extent they did.
Or when.
There was a conscious decision not to process this particular person's car. It was determined that would not, I guess, a profitable venture. That would not be a worthwhile venture at the time. That was not an avenue that they were aggressively going down. And so they chose not to process the car.
Right. And the car was obtained and processed 4 years later, and
right.
There was evidence of blood found in the trunk. Now, a Cincinnati Reporter actually had a piece where she said the blood found in the trunk was not Caitlyn's. Fill us in on what was different about what she said and the actual tooth.
My understanding about the evidence that was found in the car is that it was not at this time with the level of technology that we have. They were not able to determine whether or not that was Caitlyn's blood.
So they couldn't determine the DNA, or
they certainly don't know that it is Caitlyn's. I don't know that they can eliminate it from being Caitlyn's either.
Right.
They can't say it's not my blood or your blood, or they don't have the ability to say whose blood it is.
Right. So there was no DNA found on the swabs that they took, but in a pre-test, a luminol test, it did show up as blood, but they were unable to determine. So that's much different than saying, it's not hers. At this point, I think we can agree that it's an unknown at this point.
Yeah, I'm not. I think they're calling it blood. I suppose as a defense attorney, I could argue about whether or not it was human blood or whether or not it was actually blood. But the suggestion is that it was blood, that they did find blood, but they were not able to get a DNA profile and therefore not able to link it to Caitlyn.
But of course, it kind of makes you wonder. It makes me wonder, as an investigator, if they would have done that 4 years earlier, what the results would have been.
Well, absolutely. As a defense attorney, I wouldn't care, right? That's not my problem.
Right.
I suppose if I were the prosecutor or somebody investigating this would be a letdown. The idea is, it looks like there's some kind of bias there. Had we checked this out sooner, maybe we would have discovered that it was blood, or that it wasn't blood, or that it was someone else's blood, or that it was an animal's blood, or maybe 4 years ago it wasn't there. That's the problem. We don't know because it was checked 4 years later.
Right.
There are ways of, we can go through the chain of custody of who has the car and try to back out what did and didn't happen. There's always going to be a doubt raised as to what it was. Obviously, if we were able to get a DNA profile, that certainly does limit it, because if we do find Caitlyn's blood in the back of his car, and we know that Caitlyn has been dead for 4 years, that certainly takes care of whether or not it got there 4 years ago or not.
Right.
But right now, we don't have the technology to do that.
Absolutely, and they're improving on that all the time. So.
Right, exponentially. Things that we never thought we could do 4 or 5 years ago, we can do. So maybe we can't. Maybe technology will not advance for us to be able to do this. But based upon the last 30 years of technological advancements, I wouldn't feel confident saying that there's no way we'll ever know, because I think we will get to the point where the technology will advance to where we'll be able to know what this blood is. Is it Caitlyn's? Is it not Caitlyn's? what is it? I think that I'm not going to say that technology will advance to the point where we'll be able to say that's certainly Caitlyn's blood, because it may not be.
Right.
And I do think we'll get to the point where we'll be able to identify whether or not it is. And I would think that 4 years ago, if Caitlyn's blood had been there, I think we do have the technology, and we did have it 4 years prior to following the car, that we're pretty good about being able to identify fresh blood. And if the blood had been there when Caitlyn was disappeared, and had it been processed, then I think at that point, if we had said, whatever this is too old to identify, then we could have been a little relieved to say, well, then it's not relevant, because the things that we're looking for have happened in the last few days. So, and if it had been fresh, then at that time, then certainly it could have been processed. So, they made a decision. They made a decision not to go down that road, and I suppose hindsight is 20/20. The question is, was that a good decision, right? I mean, obviously they couldn't process every car in Fairfield. That would be silly. The question is, was this car and the connection that this person had to Caitlyn, and to Caitlyn most specifically around the time that she went missing, would that in and of itself suggest that the car should have been processed? Well, that's an investigative question, not a defense attorney question, right?
Correct.
So, I suppose if I were representing somebody that who were being charged, and I knew that, and they didn't own this car, let's say, I knew this was out there, it's certainly something I might throw out there and say, well, hey, isn't it true that you chose not to look at this car, and years later we find out there's a suggestion there's blood there. So that would be a way that I, who was representing somebody else, could point at this guy and say, well, we never looked at him very hard, did we?
Right.
It's a way of trying to raise reasonable doubt, and that might be something I would do. Okay. And if, this guy is just the mailman, then I don't know how persuasive that is, but if this guy is somebody known to have
seen Caitlyn,
close to her, or known to have been seen with her close to the time she disappeared, then it might be more persuasive.
So the question arises, should we, if in doubt, process it? Or do we just let that car go bye-bye without doing anything to it? If you were the detective for Fairfield Police Department in the initial investigation, especially knowing who Brad Von Bargen is and where he was just hours before Caitlyn disappeared. What do you think? So I kind of want to get your opinion on it. Some of you may have a law enforcement background, or you might be an attorney, or just a person that has no background in investigation or law. I want your opinion too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a picture on the Gone at 21 Facebook page, and I want you to make a comment. It's very simple. Don't process or process. Referring to if you were the detective in charge back in 2011 investigating this case. This next clip is Detective Vance Patton of the Indiana State Police just confirming the results of the swabs.
There was no DNA, so whatever was submitted, could not come back identifiable.
This could mean several different things. It could have been repeatedly shampooed, cleaned with strong chemicals, which could have diluted the blood, or it could have been animal blood. Also, the extreme heat in the garage it was kept in could affect the outcome, or a combination of cleaning and heat. The fact of the matter is, unless advances in DNA pop up sometime soon, it's going to be a long time before we find out whose blood that is, whether it was Caitlyn's or someone else's, if we ever find out. You heard me mention a reporter that claimed that the blood was not Caitlyn's. And I'll have to admit, most of the reporters in the Cincinnati area do a great job of confirming facts before going on the air. Unfortunately, one reporter who I have never spoken to did not do a very good job of verifying. Let's hear this clip.
The blood evidence he talked about has been tested. Learned it came from the back seat of a car and is not Caitlyn's.
First, it was the trunk where the blood was found, not the back seat. Second, the lab was unable to obtain DNA from the blood, so they were unable to get a DNA profile. That statement that she made where she said it was not Caitlyn's, that is not an accurate description of the truth. In my opinion, this was misleading and careless reporting at minimum. We don't know if the blood was Caitlyn's, which continues to leave another unknown on the table in reference to the Katelyn Markham case. I believe it was a very bad decision by the Fairfield Police Department in the early days of this investigation not to process Brad Von Bargen's car. So let me just tell you where everything was after coming back from Ohio at the end of my second trip. At this time in the investigation, the benefactor decided he was no longer going to fund the investigation. He was funding a documentary about Caitlyn, and then I found out he had hired a psychic. This was disappointing, and I felt the documentary was a good idea, but the timing was just not right. I was in the middle of an investigation, and now it's stalled, and everything cooled off. And hiring a psychic? Well, that just takes more and more money away from the investigation. I felt the benefactor lost his way and forgot what we were trying to accomplish. But it is his money, and he can spend it any way he wants. He didn't tell me about the psychic. Tammy and I were speaking one day on the phone, and she mentioned that the benefactor hired a psychic and she was going to drive her around. Later, the benefactor and I started speaking again, and he gave me a copy of the psychic report. Unfortunately, the psychic mentioned the killer will bargain with the police in the spring of 2016, giving away the second person responsible for Caitlyn's death. That didn't happen. I'm positive because if it did happen, this would have been a huge announcement by law enforcement, and someone would be in jail awaiting trial. No arrests and no announcement, and it's almost the summer of 2017, so we missed that mark. The psychic also claimed a couple of Caitlyn's items were still retained by one of the suspects. I know for a fact the police have one of those items she mentioned in their custody, and they had that item in their custody before the psychic arrived in Fairfield. So, money well spent. Look, the benefactor has spent a lot of money on the Markham case. I would bet he has spent close to, if not more than, the Fairfield Police Department. People don't do that for others anymore. That part of being involved with this benefactor was great. I only wish he maintained focus on the goal we set for this investigation. The benefactor later changed his mind, had a change of heart. Approximately a month after he cut the investigation out, he wanted me to go to North Carolina to interview Brad Von Bargen to see if I could get further with Brad in obtaining information. The trip to North Carolina and some tall tales. Next time on Gone at 21. Please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please don't forget to rate and review. Check out the Gone at 21 Facebook page for more information and updates. Until next time, I'm Jay Ryan. Take care.